Welcome to part one of the Dyslexia 101 module. We call this module 101 because you're about to take a crash course in all things dyslexia. So let's jump right in. In this module, I'm going to take you through the basics of dyslexia. Let's talk about a roadmap for this module. The overarching themes are simply what, so what, and now what. In the what section, we'll discuss what dyslexia is and isn't. We'll also explore research on dyslexia because luckily there is a lot of it out there. In the so what section, I'll attempt to answer the questions you or maybe someone in your life may ask, and that's so what? Why should I care about dyslexia? I'll highlight the importance of learning about dyslexia and how this critical information can impact any struggling readers you may have in your life. Lastly, in the Now What section, we'll put all of that information into practice and I'll share additional resources and next steps you can take with the newly acquired information. It's important for me to let you know that the information I will share, while a lot, is just the tip of the iceberg. Another quick tip. This will be a fairly dense module, so please feel free to take breaks. And then when you're ready, just come on back. Additionally, to make it easier to include breaks, I've broken this module into three separate videos. These videos cover each of the parts of the roadmap that you see on your screen. In an effort to frame our discussion a bit, I want to take a moment to allow each of you to think about something that you've tried to do several times, but you just couldn't do it. You couldn't master it. Maybe you'd really hoped to learn how to juggle, bake, or ride a bike. Maybe underwater basket weaving has eluded you for years. Whatever it is, I want you to think about the time you tried to do it and you failed. As you reflect on that memory or experience, how did it feel? What are some of the ways you would describe that experience of trying your best and failing? Now imagine everyone else around you can do that thing, and that particular thing, more than anything else, is considered to be a measure of your intelligence. Just for a moment, imagine people around you being shocked you can't do the activity. You can't whistle? How are you ever going to be successful in your life? I think you understand what I'm getting at here. And if I'm honest, a more accurate picture of what dyslexia is like would be to have you consider a genetic trait that you wish you had, but you don't. Wish you were taller? Maybe you want brown eyes instead of blue. Consider being told all you have to do is work harder. You're just lazy. That's why you're short. You just need to focus more and you could have freckles. Students with dyslexia who struggle to read are not being lazy. They don't need to focus more and they don't need to work harder. In fact, researchers at the University of Washington conducted a study that found children with dyslexia were using nearly 5 times as much area of their brain to do the same language tasks as a control group. This means their brains were working a lot harder and using more energy than the children without dyslexia. What I hope to show you in this module is that people with dyslexia don't need to work harder. They need people who understand and support them. And more than anything, they need instruction that was created for their beautiful and complex brains. I also hope you'll walk away from this course with an awe of the resilience and courage of dyslexic students and children. Um, that they have when it comes to school. It can be hard to struggle in a learning environment, and it takes immense courage to show up and give it your best every day in an environment that may or may not support you. Before we leave this slide, it's worth sharing that every one of us is born with an innate ability to communicate using oral language. Reading, however, is something we all must learn to do. So even though it may seem that some children pick it up quicker, that is true. They can pick it up quicker. We still all need to learn how to read. It's not something that we're born with. Okay. So what is dyslexia? I'm happy to report that dyslexia is one of the most researched learning disorders. That's probably because 85% of students with a learning disability actually have dyslexia. We'll get into some of the research a little later. For now, I want to share the definition or a definition of dyslexia. I like this particular definition because it's clear and straightforward, and it was also informed by Dr. Sally Shaywitz, which I'll introduce you to soon. She is a major rock star in the dyslexia space. Okay, so the definition states that dyslexia is an unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader, most commonly caused by a difficulty in phonological processing, which affects the ability of an individual to speak, read, write, and spell. There are a few things to unpack here, so let's slow down and take this one chunk at a time. The first part of the definition, an unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader, is important because it underscores the fact that reading and intelligence, or IQ, are not linked in students who struggle to read. Students with dyslexia can be extremely bright but still struggle to read. It's important that people know this distinction between intelligence and dyslexia so they don't make an assumption about the individual. This becomes critical in a learning environment. The reason it's important to pause here and make that distinction is because reading is one of the very first skills children are asked to do. When seemingly everyone around them can do this task, it often makes them feel less intelligent than their peers, when in reality, that's just not the case. We'll talk more about self-esteem struggles that children with dyslexia face and why it's important to get them help as quickly as possible later in the course. The other important thing to mention here is not just children who are currently facing this, but adults who have lived their lives thinking they aren't very smart because they struggled or continue to struggle to read into adulthood. If we don't arm parents, teachers, administrators, and counselors with factual knowledge and research about dyslexia, we risk generations of people telling themselves this false narrative that they aren't smart for years. Now let's dig into the second part of that definition of dyslexia. So it is most commonly caused by a difficulty in phonological processing, which affects the ability of an individual to speak, read, write, and spell. So, what is phonological processing? To understand this term, we first need to know that language is broken down into individual sounds called phonemes. For example, if I ultimately want to be able to read or spell the word cat, I first need phonemic awareness. Phonemic who now? Phonemic awareness involves an understanding of and knowledge about phonemes. But what is a phoneme? Phonemes are the smallest building blocks of language. They are the individual sounds in our language. On your screen, you have the example, excuse me, cat. In order to be able to read this word, let alone spell this word, I first need to understand that there are individual sounds that make up the word cat. I need to be able to make sense of the sound k, a, t. Phonemic awareness has nothing to do with letters. It's sound based only. Once phonemic awareness has been established or strengthened, then students can start to consider how these sounds correlate to letters that they've started to learn about or hear about. This is the connection between phonemes and graphemes. And graphemes is really just a fancy name for a letter or letters that represent a phoneme. This process of connecting sounds, to letters is often referred to as phonics. For example, C says k, A says a, and T says t. What makes this especially tricky is the fact that in our language, there are consonants and vowels that can make more than one sound. For example, there are 26 letters, but 44 phonemes. In just our example here, the k sound could come from a C or a K. As you consider this example and then think about other words like phone, where the f sound is spelled with PH, and words like look and shoot, they both have double O's, but the double O's are saying two different sounds. I digress slightly with these examples, but needless to say, phonemic awareness and phonemes are extremely important. And without a strong or solid foundation in these skills, our children with dyslexia, who research has shown have deficits in their phonemic processing, can struggle a lot. Let's slow down a bit and learn a little bit more about phonemes and phonemic awareness, as well as phonological awareness. With dyslexia, phonemes and phonemic awareness is where all of the difficulty begins. For example, students with dyslexia may struggle with the following task. Just a quick note before we jump into these, I have a headset on, so some of the individual sounds I'm about to say into the mic may be hard for you to hear, but I don't think that will take away from the ability to understand what I mean from each example. So first up, phoneme segmentation. For example, what sounds do you hear in the word hot? What's the last sound in the word map? Phoneme deletion. What word would be left if the k sound were taken away from cat? Phoneme matching. Do pen and pipe start with the same sound? There's phoneme counting. How many sounds do you hear in the word tape? Phoneme substitution. What word would you have if you changed the in hot to? The reason I put an asterisk by this particular bullet point is because this is by far one of the hardest tasks for students to perform. Remember when I said, actually, I don't think I mentioned this. Well, working memory, that is the ability to hold onto individual bits of information in order to be able to use them in the near future, is a challenge for students with dyslexia. What substitution is asking students to do is first know the individual sounds in the word hot, then take one of those sounds at either the beginning, middle, or end and change them to a different sound altogether. It can be very challenging. Next up, blending. What word would you have if you put these sounds together? S, ah, t. Rhyming. Tell me as many words as you can that rhyme with the word eat. And this larger umbrella is called phonological awareness. Under this umbrella are other skills that include not only being able to recognize different sounds, but also being able to manipulate those sounds or parts of words. To say I'm oversimplifying phonological awareness and phonemic awareness would be an understatement. But rest assured, there is a true science to learning how to read. And as someone who doesn't have dyslexia, I had several mind blowing moments while reading research about how we learn to read and how we read in general. Mainly because I didn't struggle to read, I didn't realize how much my brain was doing while I was unaware I was doing it. Additionally, although dyslexia involves a tremendous amount of brain physiology, I won't be exploring that in great detail. I will leave it to those who do the research. So, if you're interested in learning more, let me introduce you to someone who can be your guide. Please meet Dr. Sally Shaywitz. She is a neuroscientist, and at the time of this recording, she is a professor of pediatrics at Yale, co founder and co director of the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, and she is one of the leading researchers of dyslexia in our country. She was recruited by Yale in 1979 and started working on her longitudinal studies of students in 1983. A longitudinal study is research that examines participants over an extended amount of time, in this case, decades. She tracked a random cohort or group of children continuously from kindergarten up well into adulthood. At the time of this course, the adults are in their 40s. Her research has been invaluable to understanding and addressing dyslexia. And what you'll often hear when people mention her research is the first use of fMRIs, and that stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. And it's a technique for measuring and mapping brain activity while the patient is doing something such as reading, hence the functional part of the fMRI. We've learned a tremendous amount of dyslexia from her studies. For instance, from Dr. Shaywitz's research, we learned that at its core, dyslexia is a phonological processing problem. I know we just covered this, but I also know if this is new information for you, then it bears repeating. A phonological processing problem means that individuals with dyslexia may have issues with the ability to retain, decipher, and retrieve the sounds of letters in order to decode the written word. This also gives us an understanding into why dyslexia can cause the most difficulty early in someone's life. It's because this is the time when many children are trying to make sense of letters and sounds. And this is also why parents of children with dyslexia can see how quickly their child can get behind in school if dyslexia is not addressed swiftly and properly. Phonemes, that is, understanding the sounds letters makes, are the building blocks of language just as cells are the building blocks of life. If a student doesn't get the most fundamental part of language down early, it's hard to really understand or become fluent with the more complex elements of language and communication. You see, reading for people without dyslexia becomes an automatic process after a while. This is not the same for people with dyslexia, especially if they haven't received intensive multisensory explicit reading and spelling instruction. We'll discuss all of those terms a little bit later, but for now, let's discuss the next bullet point. Parents or teachers may hear the word dyslexia and assume it affects intelligence, but because you've already done your research, you know this isn't true. Dyslexia represents a specific difficulty with reading, not with thinking skills. Students with dyslexia can be and often are extremely bright. They can comprehend spoken language and other higher level reasoning skills. Dyslexia, as Dr. Shaywitz reports, is a localized problem. It doesn't reflect an overall deficient and defect in language, but a localized weakness within a specific component of the language system. That's the phonological model. She calls it the phonological module. Also, from Dr. Shaywitz's research, we learned that dyslexia is not rare. In fact, roughly 1 in 5 people have some form of dyslexia, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. I'd like to talk about this last bullet just a little bit more because as I was thinking about the estimated prevalence of dyslexia being up to 20%, I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about more well known conditions that actually have lower prevalence rates than dyslexia, just the kind of because this was a little shocking to me. What I find interesting in my own experience is that the fact that dyslexia never even occurred to me, nor anyone else in my child's lives, as a potential cause for their reading disability. I think it's simply because, excuse me, I didn't know much about dyslexia. However, I've heard of or know people with and understand some signs and symptoms of asthma, autism, and diabetes. So I wanted to share this because I was just kind of floored. I feel like the conversations around asthma or autism or diabetes, there's not a stigma, right? There is especially with asthma and diabetes, there is a physical manifestation in the body, right? And also, even with autism, even though there's a psychological component there, there's not a stigma behind it as there is with reading. Not being able to read well or struggling to read often brings a stigma of, like we've already said, is this person intelligent? And so I think that's why dyslexia doesn't isn't as well known as it could be. And please note before I leave, the prevalence rates of asthma, autism, and diabetes was found using Google as just a frame of reference. So if by the time you're watching this, you happen to Google the prevalence rates of asthma and find it slightly above or slightly below, please don't hold me to this exact number. Okay, as shown in this figure from Shaywitz's research, scientific evidence now provides empirical support for the unexpected nature of dyslexia. The left panel shows the relationship between IQ and reading in a typical reader. Here, IQ and reading both track together. They're dynamically linked. IQ influences reading and reading influences IQ. In contrast, the right panel shows the relationship between IQ and reading in dyslexic children. Here, IQ and reading disassociate. They're uncoupled. They kind of go their own ways. In practical terms, these data provide strong evidence that in dyslexia, a person can have with dyslexia, sorry, a person can have a very high IQ and yet read at a much lower level. So please rest assured, if your child has dyslexia, their inability to be able to read has nothing to do with their intelligence. I'm going to sound a little like an infomercial, but wait, there's more. Through Dr. Shaywitz's research and others like her, we've learned there isn't a cure for dyslexia. If someone tries to convince you they have a cure for dyslexia, they are lying. Although the disorder may be less pronounced as an individual grows up, it doesn't mean that dyslexia has gone away or that the individual has outgrown it. It normally means that they have learned to compensate for their weaknesses, but that can also mean that there are still holes in their language and communication abilities. Students with dyslexia can improve their reading, however, with extensive instruction that follows a specific method called Orton Gillingham, and we'll dive into that a little later. Next up, dyslexia has a genetic component. In Dr. Sally Shaywitz's first edition of Overcoming Dyslexia, she said one of the most important predictive factors is a family history of a reading problem. Asking a parent if there is someone in their family who has had or has difficulty reading in the family, whether it's a parent or grandparent or the aunt uncle, is one of the many helpful indicators that can assist families in getting closer to a dyslexia diagnosis. In the second edition of her book, there was a little more written regarding this element, including, quote, like many common conditions, such as type 2 diabetes, dyslexia sometimes runs in families. Having a parent or sibling who is dyslexic increase the probability that you are too, but it doesn't mean that you were going to develop dyslexia. End quote. In my opinion, I think the discussion about the genetic influence in Dr. Shaywitz's second edition seems to be quite a bit more nuanced than her original edition. But that can also be a result of science growing and learning over time. What once may have seemed simple to declare, now we're learning there are lots of different genes that could be involved in someone having dyslexia. So it's not just one gene that you can test for. Instead, it's many genes and how they are expressed. Hold on just a moment. I'm going to take a drink of water. Even with this update to her book, I still thought it was important to share here because in many families, a child will get a diagnosis of dyslexia and then a light bulb will go off on a parent or grandparent or loved one's head about their own experience and why they may have struggled to read when they were in school. Bullet point number three. I've heard someone use this phrase before that dyslexia sometimes comes with friend. This is one way of saying that there is a high comorbidity rate with dyslexia and other learning disorders or neurological disorders. Comorbidity essentially means, excuse me, let me move this over. Um, Okay, sorry. Okay, so when we're talking about comorbidity, essentially it means two or more disorders existing together. So it's not uncommon to see students with dyslexia as well as ADHD, anxiety, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, or some other disorder. It's also important to mention that it's not entirely uncommon for a student with dyslexia to exhibit signs of ADHD, such as acting out, distractibility, disengagement, etc., as a reaction to dealing with dyslexia. For example, if a student has difficulty reading, they may act out if asked to read out loud in class to try to get out of reading out loud so they don't get embarrassed in front of their peers. A student who has dyslexia may fidget or become distracted when they feel overwhelmed with not being able to read when the rest of the class can. This is why a full evaluation is so important for parents to get to the root of the issues that the student is dealing with. Quite simply, we can't get help for something if we don't know exactly what we're dealing with. And finally, I find this next point really important to share, especially with family members who may be experiencing a new dyslexia diagnosis in their family. There's nothing that quote unquote went wrong genetically. It's simply different wiring in the brain. Too often, parents who are facing a dyslexia diagnosis often see all the challenges that our children have or will face, and it's hard to see that dyslexia can also bring tremendous strengths. If I could offer any advice, it's the fact that dyslexia is such a small part of what an individual is as a whole. We'll talk about ways to cope, sorry, we'll talk about ways to focus on the strengths while coping with the challenges this disorder brings later in the course. But before we leave the section, it's important for me to share a resource that I found as invaluable as Dr. Shaywitz's book. I have a fairly big stack of books on the subject of dyslexia that I own and recommend, but this book is easily in the top three. Where Dr. Shaywitz's book is heavy in research and how dyslexia affects individuals, as well as the diagnosis process and more, the Dyslexic Advantage takes us on a deep dive into the amazing strengths of those individuals with dyslexia. Using the acronym MIND, they showcase four themes of strengths, including material, interconnected, narrative, and dynamic. Normally, someone with dyslexia will excel at one or two of these, but typically not all. However, one strength area alone is packed full of amazing skills. You can read the short description of each strength on the screen, a thank you to the Dyslexia Reading Connection for the clear and concise hallmarks of each strength. I wanted to share a little bit about specific fields that individuals with these strengths may naturally gravitate toward and typically over index in per the author's research in the book. For those with material strengths, some potential professions that they would excel at include engineering, mathematics, architecture, etc. For those with interconnected strengths, some jobs that would allow them to showcase their skills include zoologist, museum director, historian, physicist, computer software designer, or chef. For those with narrative strengths, great career options include author, songwriter, psychologists, and attorneys. And finally, for those individuals with dyslexia who happen to have dynamic strengths, some potential professions that would align with these strengths include entrepreneurs, which they estimate 35% of entrepreneurs have dyslexia thanks to their ability to find innovative solutions to problems and out of the box thinking. Additionally, farmers, business consultants, economists, or in medicine, such as immunology or oncology. The career examples I mentioned under each strength aren't just good options. More often than not, individuals who have dyslexia are leaders in these fields. The authors drop some pretty big names regularly throughout the book, which makes reading this book a real treat. This book is worth its weight in gold, especially for the following readers. If you have dyslexia and have only been told or lived the challenges of the diagnosis, this book is for you. If you suspect someone you love has dyslexia and you don't know where to start, but you want to learn more, this book is for you. If you are a parent of a child you suspect has dyslexia or has been recently diagnosed, this book is definitely for you. As parents, we often worry about the challenges, but this book celebrates in a very big way the beautiful strengths that come with dyslexia, and they showcase why dyslexia is an advantage. Okay, so before we move out of the what portion and into the so what portion of this module, let's have a quick 3 question true or false check in to see what we've learned. I'll read each of the following and you can either write down your answer or just mentally keep track of them. Okay, so number one, research estimates around 5% of the population has dyslexia. Is that true or false? Number two, true or false? Dyslexia is a phonological processing disorder. And number three, true or false? Dyslexia and intelligence are linked. Okay, lock in those answers. Let's see how we did. So, number one, that is false. The research estimates up to 20% of the population has some form of dyslexia. The next one is true. Yes, it is a phonological processing disorder. And then the third one, that is false. Dyslexia and intelligence are not linked. Dyslexia is an unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader. All right, that's it for now. I'll see you over in part two.